Wonderful.
I'm sure it's because of you, not me.
No, that's not true.
I did one last year. We had 5 people, so it might be true.
Everybody
It's
loves to hear about manatees, the manatee protect.
well, I'm sure the topic helps, and also it's free. We were chatting before you got on, and she was curious if you had studied about marine wildlife in college or if it was something you learned on the job.
A little bit of both. I started as a biology and zoology major, so I was always interested in biology. And then, but most of my actual hands-on experience, came from the job.
Sure.
Yeah.
I love that video of the manatee swimming. That's
Yeah,
pretty
it's
cool.
beautiful. It's what the habitat's supposed to look like, right?
Yeah, exactly. We can figure out a way to embed those in the presentations for the summer. That would be pretty cool. I'm sure you have some great videos of the bottlenose.
Yeah, I do.
The only problem with that approach, as we found out, is the strength of the internet connection. Should be about ready to start.
Laura is having troubles getting on really quick, but I just emailed her the link again. So
Okay.
she's gonna retry.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I've done dozens of these and I've never been on one that didn't have some glitch occur. It's just the nature of the technology. There's Laura.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes, how you doing?
Good. Sorry to jump on so late, guys. I have had a heck of a morning, we'll just say.
No, we're good. Thank you for doing this.
No, thank you, Ralph. You're doing all of the heavy lifting here. We really appreciate it.
Well, Ashley, actually, but thank you.
Okay, I have your bios up. Is there anything else that you want me to cover that's not in your bios that you sent me, doing my job for me, making my life easy? Thanks, Ralph.
Of course. Nope, I'm good. Ashley, you?
No, let's dive in.
Okay, well, great. So I think that we're recording the webinar. We're ready to get started. Thanks everybody to joining us this morning. I wanted to introduce Ralph and Ashley. Ralph is a shareholder with the Tallahassee firm Guilday Law. He's a graduate of Stetson University and FSU Law. He has 40 years experience in environmental law, including marine and land wildlife and their habitat. He is a current member of the Executive Council and past chair of the Animal Law section. He's a frequent author and lecturer on environmental and animal law and an adjunct professor of animal law at FSU Law and Stetson Law. And you are all in for a treat this morning. If you haven't seen Ralph speak before, he is a wonderful presenter, and we're very grateful to have him here with us at the Animal Law section. Ashley is at Landwerlen. Perfect. Is an FSU Law 2024 JD candidate. She's the pro bono chair for the FSU Law chapter of SALDF. She's the administrative editor of the FSU Journal of Land Use and Environmental Law. She's an ALS student member and a legal intern with Pets Ad Litem. She has 10 years experience in animal care and training, including 5 years with marine mammals and 5 years with service dogs. And we are very lucky to have Ashley with us and look forward to having her at many more CLEs and other animal law section events. For those of you who are first time joining us for an animal law section webinar, we do like to host these free webinars periodically. If you're interested in more animal law section content, please make sure that you join our section. You'll get email reminders and access to this and more CLEs and other great animal law content, including articles, newsletters, all that kind of great stuff. We would love to have you join the section. And with that, I will hand things off to Ralph and Ashley.
Thank you so much, Laura. We appreciate your support as well. And I've asked Gabrielle to handle the slides. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Gabrielle. This is just an overview of our presentation. Ashley and I have a specific love of marine wildlife and in particular manatees. She's going to talk in a minute about the species itself with her expertise and background. For those of you that don't know, the manatee is the official marine mammal of the state of Florida, which makes it even more special. We're going to talk about the federal and state laws. We're going to put a little bit of focus on the crisis in the Indian River Lagoon, which some of you may be familiar with. Talk about some of the issues that affect manatee habitat. We'll talk about the unusual mortality event that's occurring. And Ashley has some background and experience with rescue, rehab, and release. So she'll talk about that and the FWC experimental feeding program that we've been involved with. Ashley actually was an intern with FWC last year. There's a specific case that we're going to talk about as well that's currently pending in federal court against the DEP. Then we'll talk a little bit about permitting for feeding the manatees, and then some current actions to address seagrass loss and protect Florida manatees. Next, please. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Ashley, and we're going to tag team this throughout.
Awesome. Thanks, Ralph. And thank you again. I want to thank the Animal Health section for inviting me today. It's a wonderful opportunity to get to share some of my professional background working with captive marine mammals and one of my favorite species, the manatee. So just to give everyone a brief overview of the Florida manatee, the Florida manatee is actually a subspecies of the West Indian manatee, also known as the North American manatee. West Indian manatees are the largest living member of the Sirenians, which is a taxonomy classification for the order Sirenia. Other Sirenians include the dugong, which you can find in Australia, the Persian Gulf, East Africa, and South Asia, and the extinct Steller's sea cow. But the West Indian manatee has two subspecies, the one we're discussing today, which is the Florida manatee, and a second subspecies, the Antillean manatee, which is found throughout the coastal waters of the Caribbean. As Ralph had mentioned, the Florida manatee is our state's official marine mammal, and it is also a keystone species. So when biologists or regulations refer to a keystone species, what they're referring to is that this particular species, the Florida manatee, it holds basically its aquatic environment in balance. And because it does that, it's a really good indicator species when things are kind of going awry within its environment. When we look at this species and either its behavior or its overall health, overall population health, it can give biologists and regulators a clue as to the overall health of the entire ecosystem. So when we talk about the seagrasses, the big die-off of seagrasses later on, we saw that the starvation event that happened in manatees gave us that indication of the overall poor health of their habitat. Adults are typically 9 to 10 feet in length, and they typically range between 500 and 1,000 pounds. However, the biggest recorded manatee so far was up to 3,600 pounds. So very large animals. They're if they're in a healthy environment, they can live for decades. I think it's estimated that, I found that it's estimated that manatees live an estimated of 50 years in the wild. And the oldest recorded manatee lived in captivity. His name is Snooty, and he lived to 69 years old. So given a healthy environment and adequate habitat, they're able to live for decades. Manatees are aquatic herbivores. So it basically means they're much like an aquatic cow. They are grazing on the seagrasses and other freshwater aquatic vegetation, and that does provide them their primary food source. Their native habitat includes our state's coastal waters, rivers, and springs. They are a migratory species, so when it's the colder months, they're going to migrate up into our Florida springs, maybe even up into the Georgia's warmer waters. And this just allows them to stay warm during those colder months. And as Ralph will get into a little bit later, this includes the Indian River Lagoon. Some of the threats do include boat collisions. Today, we're going to focus more on the red tide, blue-green algae blooms, and starvation event. And this has to do with the habitat loss. So the breakdown and the pollution of those seagrass beds leads to a lot of these issues that we're going to discuss further today. So we can go to the next slide. I'm going to do a brief overview of the federal laws at play that govern the manatees conservation and management. The two primary ones at play in our discussion today are the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So currently, the manatee is federally listed as a threatened species, and therefore it is protected under the Endangered Species Act. The ESA defines threatened species as those likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant portion of its range. So the manatee was listed as endangered, and it was delisted from endangered down to threatened in 2017. However, this past October of 2023, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said it was conducting a formal review trying to decide if it's now going to actually uplist the species again as endangered. Moving to the Marine Mammal Protection Act, both the ESA and the Marine Mammal Protection Act have prohibitions against take of a species. And take means it is illegal to feed, harm, harass, hunt, shoot, capture, or kill either a listed species under the ESA, which would include in this case the manatee, and then under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, any marine mammal, regardless of its status as either threatened or endangered, it is illegal to take that species. The Marine Mammal Protection Act, the definition of marine mammal does include the order Sirenia, which is what we've discussed earlier today. And this does comprise the Western Indian manatee and, of course, its subspecies, the Florida manatee. You'll see as we go through the discussion a little bit, there's a little bit of interplay between if a manatee is classified as a wild animal and what department manages that. So for wild manatees, the Department of Interior through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will kind of oversee wild manatees. If, however, a manatee is non-releasable and it's going to live its entire life in captivity, then it will be regulations from the Department of Agriculture and the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service will regulate those captive animals. Next slide, please. And just a brief overview of our state laws governing manatee conservation and management. We have the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act of 1978. And it explicitly states that it's unlawful for any person at any time, by any means, or in any manner, intentionally or negligently, to annoy, molest, harass, or disturb, or attempt to molest, harass, or disturb any manatee, injure or harm, or attempt to injure or harm any manatee. So this is the same provision that actually provides that the Florida manatee is our official state marine mammal. And so it just really shows that there are strong protections in place and that there's an intrinsic value that Floridians find in the Florida manatee, which kind of pushes us to want to actually protect its habitat. Other state protections at play include the state mandated manatee protection plans, and these are approved areas or plans by federal and state local governments, and they ensure the long-term protection of manatees and their habitat within a county boundary. The key counties involved here include Brevard, Broward, Citrus, Collier, Duval, Indian River, Lee, Martin, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, Sarasota, St. Lucie, and Volusia County. And these plans are used by the FWC and other regulatory agencies when reviewing permit applications for new and expanding boat facilities. And then another last protection that we're going to cover today includes the manatee protection zones. And these are, again, designated by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. And this includes sanctuaries and refuges. And they're also, in addition to these designations, there may be other local, state, and federal zones at play. And I'll turn it back to you, Ralph.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're going to focus on the Indian River Lagoon, as I mentioned, for a very specific reason. A wildlife biologist that we work with describes what's happening there as a localized extinction event. It is truly an animal and environmental catastrophe that's occurring, and it's as a result of human activities in the form of pollution. More on that in a minute. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, you can see the location on the map, and it is a very, very, very long multi-mile grouping of lagoons on the Florida Atlantic coast, the Mosquito Lagoon, Banana River, and Indian River in the Brevard County area. Next, please. And this is just an aerial photo to give you a better sense of what it looks like there. Okay, so there are several sources of manatee habitat pollution. Harmful algal blooms are linked to non-point source nutrient pollution. The sources of those are agricultural operations, which add nitrogen and phosphorus, old or inadequate wastewater and septic systems. More on that in a minute. These harmful algal blooms shade light necessary for seagrass survival, and if long-lasting, can and do kill the seagrass. In addition to destroying the manatee's main food source, when a bloom dies, decomposition of algal cells cause low dissolved oxygen, which also can result in fish kill events, and you see a photo of one there. Next, please. Okay, so non-point source pollution is distinguished from what's point sources. Point sources are structures such as pipes and other conveyances that are specifically designed and often permitted to transport wastewaters into a particular location. Non-point sources are those that are not as controlled, not as regulated, and come from a variety of areas, and those are the ones that are the big source of problems here. There's a very, very sophisticated program. We could spend hours talking about it. We're just going to touch upon it here. But nutrient pollution, which is the primary offender here, is regulated under what's called the TMDL, or Total Maximum Daily Loads program. It's a determination of the maximum amount of a given pollutant that a surface water can absorb and still meet the water quality standards to protect human health and aquatic life. Those water bodies that do not meet these standards that are established are identified as impaired, which is the important term of art. And so these TMDLs must be developed, adopted, and implemented to reduce pollutants such as nutrients, bacteria, mercury, etc., and clean up the water body. There's a chapter in the Florida Administrative Code 62-302 that sets those limits for phosphorus, nitrogen, and chlorophyll. Beginning only recently, a couple of years ago, the DEP developed a new long-term prioritization framework called Prioritization 2.0, which lays out procedures for prioritizing TMD development. And you can see that this is a long program. It's going to go on for about 10 years in order to restore select water bodies. Next, please. Okay, again, just very quickly, because we have a lot to cover today, and you'll be able to see these slides later, but this is how the program works. It starts, and this is, by the way, a federal law that initiated this. State-developed programs are used to regulate agricultural operations. under the Basement Management Action Plans, or BMAPs, a planning tool containing state and local commitments to reduce pollution and reach TMDL goals for water bodies such as the Northern IRL BMAP, and that's in Florida statute. And then best management practices to reduce the amount of pollutants entering the state's waterways. Again, those BMPs are found in the Florida statute. Next. Okay, very quickly, when the DEP adopts a best management practice that includes agriculture, the producers must either implement state-adopted BMPs or conduct monitoring prescribed by the DEP or a water management district to show that they're not in violation of water quality standards. Again, that's statutory. Under the Clean Waterways Act, passed in 2020 and is codified in the laws of Florida, it requires the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services to complete implementation site visits every 2 years in lieu of self-reporting surveys and complete an enrollment site visit with procedures. It also requires agricultural producers in the BMP program to submit their nutrient management records to assist FDACs in achieving the program's objectives. This is an attempt to quantify better what's happening to help solve these problems. Okay, next.
Ralph, before you go on to the next slide, we've got a question from the audience.
Okay.
Someone wants to know if the sewage is mostly from animal agriculture.
If we're talking specifically about the northern IRL, no, it's not. It actually is coming from septic tanks from homes. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. It's a good question. There's over 10,000 old septic tanks, basically the old style septic tank that's just a concrete box that has an overflow and a wholly inadequate drain field system that eventually discharge into canals and other surface water bodies that make their way into the Indian River Lagoon. There's also over 10 wastewater treatment plants that periodically discharge thousands of gallons of sewage, largely untreated sewage, that also end up into the lagoon eventually. So now agriculture is also a contributor, but we've determined through our studies and consulting with experts in the data, and I don't think the state even disagrees with this, that the primary source of this pollution is these human activities.
Thank you, Ralph.
Yeah. Okay. There are setbacks associated with the BMTs. Again, Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services determines what are appropriate. They have a manual. If the non-point source dischargers included in a BMAP implement all required BMPs, their discharge is presumed to be in compliance. That means that where they implement them, the DEP is not authorized to institute proceedings against the owner of a source of pollution or to recover costs or damages. Unfortunately, however, because of the way the program is structured, approximately 2.5 million pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural chemicals, lawn fertilizers, and leaky septic tanks flow into the IRL each year. Okay, next, please. All right, I'm just this is a lot of information here. Just wanted to bring it to your attention. What are these agricultural best management practices? This is a Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services document. Urge you to take a look at it later. Next, please. Okay, so in October of 2023, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service announced it will conduct an in-depth status review and analysis to determine if the Florida manatee should be ESA uplisted from threatened to endangered, as Ashley mentioned. There's been intensive lobbying going on for several years now as we've seen the localized extinction event occurring in the IRL, Northern IRL, and that triggered this analysis. But under the ESA, manatees receive essentially the same federal habitat protection when listed as threatened as they do if listed as endangered, so it is not necessarily a panacea. Regardless of this listing status, which is still important, the manatees will continue to face starvation until more intense action is taken. Next, please. Okay, as Ashley mentioned, in their natural habitat, seagrasses are the primary source of nutrition. They also thrive on water hyacinth and other forage, but in the case of the northern IRL, what attracted the thousands and thousands of manatees to that area was the abundant seagrasses. Up until a very few years ago, when the activities that I just described, runoff from septic tanks, wastewater treatment plants, and agricultural runoff, caused the die-off of the seagrass, and it's essentially non-existent, as we'll talk about in a minute. So there's a multi-agency approach to this. We've mentioned federal and state agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, water management districts, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. They all are tasked by statute to work together. Basically, this is an overview of how it works. The DEP works with the water management districts to monitor nutrient loading in the BMAPs, like the IRL. They conduct seagrass evaluations every couple of years to determine if agricultural producers are complying. To meet seagrass regrowth requirements, required reductions are included. And then when seagrass reports indicate that it has not met the requisite growth, they will then reassess the nutrient loading allocations under the TMDL program. Next. But as I said, while certainly agriculture is a major source, the focus really in the last couple of years has been on leaking septic tanks and untreated human wastewater. So this is a nice little graphic to show you what I was describing, how these old school septic tanks were designed to work. They're basically just large tubs underneath the surface of the ground. When it fills up to a certain level, you see the outlet there, and it moves off, the property. And typically, given this very shallow water table in the coastal areas, it ends up inevitably in groundwater and surface water, including the IRL. Next, please. Okay, and just to give you an order of magnitude sense of the seriousness of the problem, from December 2019 data, 126 million gallons of sewage spilled onto the streets of Broward County neighborhoods after 6 main breaks. The infrastructure, particularly in some of these older cities, is decades and decades old. It's falling apart, frankly, and this is the result. Much of the waste-plagued canals and rivers have led to a decline in seagrass. The governor in 2019 issued an executive order directing the DEP to establish a septic conversion and remediation grant program to help local governments begin sewage improvements. Now, that's a step in the right direction, but because it's going to take a very long time to implement, it's probably not going to be in time to save the manatees and other wildlife in the northern IRL and other areas. Next, please. Okay, well, now I'm going to turn it back over to Ashley.
Yeah, so now that we've gone kind of over the causes of some of these between the agricultural runoff and the septic tanks, we're going to do an overview of the unusual mortality event that really began in 2021. There was an initial another UME, we call them, unusual mortality event in 2013, and where 830 manatees died in that year. And then we saw this again in 2021. So by the spring, by that April in 2021, 696 manatees had died. And that was nearly 460 more than the 5-year average in previous years. And again, in that spring, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service declared a new UME under the Marine Mammal Protection Act along the Indian River Lagoon. And by the end of 2021, unfortunately, we saw 1,100 total deaths of manatees. And this is when the FWC, Ralph will speak on this a little bit later, they began their experimental feeding program, which provided lettuce to hungry manatees in the IRL. Next slide, please. This unusual mortality event continued on into 2002, where we observed 800 total deaths. And the reason why in parentheses we have 76 from watercraft and 406 not necropsied, it's important to kind of notice that the statistics don't quite tell the entire story. So I think a lot of Floridians, we kind of understand that watercraft causes a pretty big threat to manatees. But in the case of a UME where the seagrass loss was so devastating, we saw much higher deaths from causes from agricultural runoff and septic tanks than from watercraft. And also it's important, this, it was during the height of COVID, so the staffing was really an issue, and a lot of these animals weren't necropsied, which provides regulators and biologists with a lot of information on causes of death. But so the statistics, while they are high, there are a little bit of unknowns within there. Do you have any comments for that, Ralph?
Yeah, I just, sadly, you'll see that photograph of the carcasses. These animals are starving. There is perhaps no worse, more painful death than a death by starvation. When they do the occasional necropsy, what they find is that their insides, their organs basically are liquefied because they're, if you will, eating themselves from the inside out. This is adults, it's babies. There's huge numbers of these. It is really a tragedy, and it's made even worse by the fact, as you will recall, that not only are they mammals, but they are the state's official marine mammal.
Absolutely. And then in 2003, this past year, again, we saw lower than the two previous years, 556 total deaths. But again, this is where we have to wonder in the statistics of whether there's fewer deaths because there are fewer manatees. Are things getting better? These regulations do take time to see the benefits actually affect the seagrass regrowth. So we're still in the fight, I guess you could say, of making sure this habitat is improved. Next slide, please. So this is where I can actually lend a lot of my anecdotal professional experience working with captive marine mammals. So when an unusual mortality event happens in Florida, we saw kind of a really incredible response by the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, also referred to as the MRP. And this is just a collection of agencies, organizations, and ocean area that work together to rescue, rehabilitate, and release Florida manatees. You can see on the slide at the bottom, those are different partners that are part of the MRP. More generally, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the management authority for wild West Indian manatees, and the North Florida Ecological Services Field Office actually has the recovery lead and coordinates the daily management of the Florida subspecies. But it really takes kind of, they say it takes a village to raise a child. It really takes a lot of coordination in order to rehabilitate the sheer numbers of animals that needed help, especially in 2021. I believe there was over 104 animals that were actually rehabilitated and sent to different oceanariums and organizations to receive rehabilitation. Next slide, please. Actually, will you go back real quick? Sorry. I did want to mention, just point out a couple of the partners here. As much as I hate to say, I am a really proud Florida State University Seminole, but the University of Florida College of Veterinary Medicine Aquatic Animal Health Program, that's led by Dr. Mike Walsh and Dr. Craig Pelton. They actually provide a clinic program to respond to stranded marine mammals in general, but they've been a really amazing resource for this response to the manatee UME. SeaWorld is actually, they receive a lot of sometimes well-deserved press as far as some of the policies around captive orcas. But just on a positive, they do provide the largest manatee rescue operation in the U.S., and they've actually provided nearly 1,300 rescues, rehabilitation, and returns of manatees since 1976. Another big actor is the Clearwater Marine Aquarium. They actually just broke ground last year to build a new $10 million manatee rehabilitation center, and this will include an intensive care unit and a surgical suite. The funding from that actually was from state allocations, which we will talk a little bit about later, and through the FWC, Duke Energy Foundation, the John Prescott Marine Mammal Rescue Assistance Grant Program, and other private donors. Next slide, please. So this goes a little more into the mechanics of how you would actually implement a rescue rehabilitation and release for an individual animal. So I do have on the slide in the middle there, this is a very young manatee. A lot of manatees were either orphaned because the mother was not able to sustain herself through the starvation event. Takes more an increased amount of calories for a nursing female. And so it really impacted nursing females during the event. So there was a lot of orphaned manatees. So you have an intake process. These partners work to try to respond to every call for a sick, injured, or orphaned manatee. And then if you look up at the top left picture, this is actually a picture of a rehab pool or a medical pool. And so it doesn't look like the most enriching environment for sure, but you can kind of think of it as a hospital room. And the floor underneath these two manatees is called a medical floor. And it's an amazing tool. It's very expensive. So the allocation of these funds is very important to actually provide the animals within these intensive care situations a medical pool. And what caretakers and veterinarians can do is raise that floor up. So if there's a critical situation where the animal care team needs to get into the water quickly and support an animal. Sometimes these animals are so sick, they need help to actually stay at the surface to breathe because they are air breathing mammals. So there's situations where you need to be able to get into the water quickly. And this type of equipment is critical in being able to do that versus having to drain the entire pool, and which can cause more stress to the animal, and it's a slower process. And then last, as far as the release, the rehabilitation process can actually take anywhere on average from 6 months. Of course, that can be a little shorter for some individual animals, or maybe up to a couple years for the rehabilitation process to happen. And once an animal is deemed releasable, the Marine Mammal Protection Act actually provides under Section 1421, provides release standards. And really, there's kind of two prongs for the release. One, the animal has to go through an evaluation and based on 6 criteria, which I won't go into all 6, but essentially it has to do with asking whether that individual animal has the ability to feed and grow to an appropriate size, whether the animal is exhibiting quote normal wild manatee behavior. So this would include the ability to surface and breathe on its own, to swim, forage, dive, and avoid dehydration without assistance. So just like us, the manatees are mammals, so hydration is very, very important, and they get that from the food that they eat if they're eating seagrasses. But they also just have to be in a captive environment. We can supplement with vitamins and hydration. We can supplement their water. Actually, something really interesting is we can actually provide marine mammals with more hydration through the form of sugar-free and flavorless jello. So it's just water and gelatin, and it can add more fresh water into their diet, especially if they're a sick animal that needs increased hydration. So there's different criteria that the partners are going to use to evaluate if the animal is a candidate for release. And then the second prong is based on that assessment, the manatee is then categorized as either releasable, conditionally releasable. There's 4 categorizations: releasable, conditionally non-releasable, or non-releasable. And you can kind of think of those categories as a spectrum, and over the animal's rehabilitation, and it can, if the condition or its circumstance changes, the animal's condition or circumstance changes, it may move to different categories. And then post rehab, once the animal is if you just go back to the last slide real quick, So in the bottom left picture, you'll see this is an actual release. So they're releasing a rehabilitated manatee. And on the back, you can see a GPS tracking equipment. So part of the Marine Mammal Protection Act release regulations require post-release GPS tracking and visual observations. I'm unsure on how long they have to do these two measures, but once the animal has shown to be successfully reintroduced into its environment, then they will remove that equipment and the animal is completely released at that point.
Hey, Ashley, we have some chat questions.
Okay.
I've got a question. Has there been an effort to require necropsies on all of the dead manatees?
I am actually unaware of a requirement. That would be great. I would say that necropsies, much like it's not as intensive, financially as intensive or labor intensive as a rehab, but it does take experts. It takes like a lot of effort to necropsy all those animals. I do not know the infrastructure of the FWC on what their requirements are as far as their protocols for necropsy. But that would be an interesting and a very useful piece of scientific information to be able to have all the data from every animal that has died. Yeah.
And let me add that we've been not successful so far for the most part in getting this to be done, but we continue to press that to be done.
Excellent. The next question that I have is, does the gelatin in the Jello have a negative impact on their diet since they are vegetarians? Which is
that's a good
thorough question for
that
any.
is very good. Yeah, because
protein.
that is animal derived. I'm unsure of that. I haven't heard of the quantity that, like, I've never personally worked with manatees. I've worked with Atlantic bottlenose dolphins and sea lions, which are carnivorous. So I've never heard if the gelatin and what quantity may affect an herbivore. So that's a great question, and I definitely am going to look into it.
Maybe they're using agar instead of
yeah.
vegetarian friendly solution. All right, thank you guys for letting me interrupt. I'm going to back out. We're not going to address the Go Knowles question because I'm a gator.
Okay, next, please. Anything more on that, Ashley?
No, sir.
Okay, next, please. All right, well, I want to take a few minutes to talk about this landmark lawsuit that was filed in last year and is still pending in federal court in Orlando, brought by Bear Warriors United, Inc., a Florida not-for-profit. Notwithstanding the name Bear Warriors, they are involved with a variety of wildlife, and they brought it against the Department of Environmental Protection under the Endangered Species Act. As a result of observing this, again, localized extinction event in the North IRL, it was felt that not enough action was being taken quickly enough to save the manatees in the IRL, and so this lawsuit was brought. I certainly urge you to take the time and can make the complaint available to you, but we don't have time to talk about the entire basis of the lawsuit. But let's go to the next slide. I thought I would highlight for you, just to show you how interesting this case is, some of the relief that is being requested here. And if you look at prayer for relief number 1, we're asking the court to issue an order that manatee starvation, death, suffering, and ill health are a consequence of the destruction of manatee habitat and food sources directly resulting from the DEP's continuing authorization of septic tanks and wastewater plants that release nitrogen into the North IRL. So this is a very specific focus of this particular litigation against the DEP. It's unprecedented, but certainly rooted in sound law. If you look at prayer for relief number 3, issue an order that the regulatory conduct by DEP constitutes an unlawful taking of a threatened species in violation of the ESA. Ashley mentioned earlier in this presentation what that means, And again, a novel but sound theory that by failing to stop the destruction of the habitat and thereby resulting in the extreme mortality event, the state has allowed a taking. Item 6, issue an order requiring DEP to provide medical monitoring and veterinarian care together with proper nutritional forage to all manatees in the North IRL until such time as sufficient seagrass that will permanently sustain manatees returns to the North IRL. This is a concept that comes from, if you will, human-animal tort law, where there's evidence of exposures to human health that cause cancers and other diseases and death. So again, somewhat unprecedented, but sound based on the relevant laws. So this is the focus of this litigation. There was a motion to dismiss filed by the DEP, 9-10 months ago, still hasn't been decided by the court, but in a recent scheduling order, it looks like there's going to be some activity later this summer and possibly a trial in the fall. This has the potential to create some significant precedent that will help wildlife throughout the state in a variety of contexts. Next, please. Okay, I also thought you would find this interesting. Ashley mentioned the fact that the state had initiated basically day-old romaine lettuce feeding, which most credible wildlife biologists will tell you is insufficient nutrition, particularly for a manatee in the wild. When they are in captivity and they're being rehabilitated, that's one thing because they're monitored more closely and they're given supplements and the like. But in the wild, there's really no evidence that this has been effective. The program lasted for about 2 years and then it was stopped. So the same group that I mentioned earlier that brought the litigation approached the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Division of Plant Industry, which regulates invasive species, and was able to convince FDACS that hydrilla that's harvested in clean freshwater lakes and rivers could, instead of being sent to landfills, could be brought to the IRL and fed to the manatees. And it is a superior forage, the water hyacinths and the other plants that, as you can see from that harvester on the right. Another concern from an environmental standpoint is the state puts out a lot of glyphosate into these waterways to kill these plants, which is causing other problems. They're finding glyphosate in the tissues of birds and fish and manatees and other creatures that inhabit these waters. So the FDACS issued the permit and then recently renewed the permit. Unfortunately, however, the proponents of this have not been able to, as yet, convince the state that it needs to actually implement this program. There's a lot of reasons that we won't talk about here for that, but it's really unfortunate because it was a great opportunity to at least to help save some of these animals because, as I mentioned, feeding them lettuce, romaine lettuce, which is primarily water and has almost no nutritional value, basically bloats them, has really not been effective. Next, please. Okay, these are some, did you want to talk about this, Ashley? Because it relates to legislation.
I'm going to do the legislative update at the end. So if you want to cover these.
Okay, thank you. As I mentioned, we're kind of tag teaming this. Now, I will say this, to try to be fair and balanced, if you will. There have been some pretty significant actions taken in the last 2 or 3 years. I think the attention that's been brought to this problem, in part, perhaps in large part as a result of the litigation I just described and intensive lobbying efforts and the obvious of the, die-off of these beautiful animals, there have been a number of laws that have been put into place. So this is just a summary of some of them. For example, last year, a new law was put in place. It dedicates $100 million annually to the Florida Forever program, the Conservation and Recreation Lands Acquisition Program, creates the IRL Protection Program, and new requirements for septic tanks. As I mentioned earlier, however, you know, to use the cliche, this may be too little too late, at least to save the manatee population in the North IRL. It will take years before we see any real benefit from any of this. But having said that, at least it's something happening there meaningfully. If this had happened a few years ago, we wouldn't have seen the mortality that we see now. Next. Okay, there's also a very focused program called Save Our Indian River Lagoon Project Plan. It outlines local projects to meet water quality targets and improve health, productivity, aesthetic appeal, and economic value of the Indian River Lagoon. It's contingent upon funding being raised. It's projected to raise $542 million over 10 years. If that seems like that's a big number to you, I've been told by knowledgeable experts that we need several $billion to really meaningfully address this problem and save the habitat and the manatee future populations. It's widely believed that the current populations are essentially lost to us, which is really, really sad. Restoring the IRL has a present value of $6 billion and a cost of $300 million. So it's an excellent investment for the county, which has been behind this. Next. Okay, there's also an Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding, an opportunity to restore the lagoon. In 2021, the president signed into law this bill. I'm sure you've heard about it. And it, among its many other provisions, it dedicates $132 million to be distributed among the national estuary programs. The IRL will be one of the recipients of that as part of the National Estuary Program and the Seagrass Nursery Network. There's some very, very encouraging developments. It looks like they're being successful in regrowing seagrasses in certain portions of the IRL. But again, as I keep saying, sadly, it is likely too little too late to save the majority of the manatee population there. Next. Okay, back to the water bodies compliance with the requirements of the law. As of this month, it's non-attainment. It is not attaining the standards. You can see on the map the colors in purple and blue that indicate that. So it just basically states what we've been saying. There's a lot of work to be done. Next, please. Okay, Ashley.
All right, so just to give you a kind of insight into some of the current legislation that's at the state level, I'll cover one that's not on the slide, and then I'll cover what's on the slide. So currently there is SB 1386 and its companion bill CSHB 1557. So that's SB 1386 and HB 1557. This is titled Department of Environmental Protection. And this bill provides that representatives from the DEP could enter and inspect during a reasonable time compliance with laws, rules, and regulations on any property that has an on-site septic system. However, there is an exclusion for buildings which are used exclusively for private residents. But other buildings, other properties, the DEP could actually inspect for compliance with on-site septic system regulation. It would also create new procedures for the DEP regarding the processing and enforcement of septic tank requirements. It directs the DEP to establish and enhance a nutrient-reducing on-site sewage treatment and disposal systems approval program. And it would also require DEP to adopt rules establishing and implementing a program of general permits for certain on-site septic treatment and disposal systems. These two bills are actually moving pretty quickly through each the House and Senate. The House bill with its committee substitute has favorably passed all three of its committee hearings and is now on the House calendar. And the Senate bill was on agenda this morning with the Appropriations Committee on Agriculture, Environment, and General Government, where it favorably passed the second of its three committee stops. And then referencing the slide here, we also have HB 1005 and SB 1354. This is titled the Indian River Lagoon Protection Program. So this is an already established program. Unfortunately, these two bills have not moved since introduced, but it would require 40% or $60 million, whichever is greater, of the proceeds paid into the Water Protection and Sustainability Program Trust Fund to be credited to Florida DEP for use in the Indian River Lagoon Protection Project. So it would just add more allocation of funds to the DEP to address this issue. That's all I have, Ralph.
Yeah, let me comment. I mean, look, anybody that follows what happens down the street here in Tallahassee understands that the politics determine the priorities and what passes and what doesn't pass. And again, to be fair and give credit where it's due, in the last couple years in particular, there has been a renewed focus on what's happening with manatees and habitat and surface water bodies all across the state, but in particular in the North IRL. But as our experts will tell you, it really is too slow and not fast moving enough. One of the positions of the DEP in the litigation I referred to earlier is that, well, the requests in the prayer for relief that I just read are moot because they're already doing all of these things. Well, again, as Ashley just mentioned, this bill, HB 1005, which is pretty significant, isn't moving in the legislature. The bills that have passed are very slow to be implemented. One of the consultants said that even if all of these measures were put into place immediately, and they won't be, it might be 10 years before we see any real beneficial effect in the IRL. So that's the purpose of the legislation, of the litigation. But we're all still trying to be hopeful through these efforts that eventually enough action will be taken to save these manatees. Next.
I wanted to let you know, if you have time, we have a few questions in the chat that I'll ask at the end. Oh, we are at the end. Well, that's excellent.
Let me make a shameless plug. If you find this and any other topic relating to animal law, which covers a variety of topics, please join us, floridabaranimals.org, or call the bar number there. We'd love to have you as part of our section. Go ahead, Laura.
Awesome. First, I wanted to say, Aaron Miller, I see that your hand is somehow raised. I don't have any way to unmute you or call on you. If you have a question, use the question and answer. That should be a little button down there at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to just type that out, I'll sneak you in if we have time. He or she says that their cat raised their hand, which is adorable and very welcome on this animal law section webinar. We all absolutely understand that, Aaron. First, we have a follow-up. We have a critical care manatee veterinarian here who says that they don't use gelatin. We tube them fluids. So everybody who is losing sleep over whether somehow secretly the manatees are eating meat, don't worry, they're getting their fluids another way.
Good.
I appreciate we have the veterinarians helping me out there, because I am not a veterinarian, but we did administer it to dolphins and sea lions, but not to manatees. So good to know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, whoever that was. I appreciate it.
Also, shameless plug, if this veterinarian needs help, or water hyacinths, my backyard's full of them, and I would love to come help feed manatees if you ever need me to, veterinarian person. Okay, thanks. The other question that we have is, are there any practical ways that we can help right now? And then another person says that they live on the IRL in an area that's frequented by manatees, and they want to know if planting seagrass in the canal behind their house would help at all.
Yeah, let me try to address that, and thank you for your offer of help. There are programs that are sanctioned by the state of Florida, as I mentioned, some experimental programs. Those water bodies are controlled and regulated by the state, so you would certainly not be able to do anything without getting state approval to do so, and there's a lot of considerations that go into that. Again, we're seeing some encouraging signs that the seagrasses can be propagated. But again, it's going to be years before there's full restoration. And just common sense will tell you, if we continue to discharge through these non-point sources, it's never going to clean up. And that's the major problem. And that's the focus of the programs that we mentioned earlier.
And also, I just like to piggyback on that and just stress, anything we talk about when it comes to rehabilitating a manatee, this is under a lot of regulation under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act. So it is in no way okay to actually go out into the wild and try to rehabilitate any on our own as citizens. That is completely under the partnership and highly regulated. So just don't be going out and trying to feed manatees lettuce.
Yeah, let me mention as well, things are so dire there and have been for the last several years that there was actually a serious proposal by one of the wildlife biologists to relocate all of the manatee out of that area, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and move them to areas maybe further south where there's seagrasses, or even into some of the freshwater bodies, the springs and rivers and lakes. They do have the technology to do that, of course, as Ashley pointed out. They will, if they see an ailing manatee, they do have the ability, but it takes an extraordinary effort and cost, and that has gone nowhere. But it is an option.
And then the last question we have, and we're at 2 minutes, is oh geez, now I have more questions. Okay, there's a question about any update on effectiveness for implementation of septic to sewer programs. And then there's a follow-up, what can those of us with septic tanks do to minimize our negative contribution? And then another person asks if there's a good place that we can donate to help the Florida manatees.
Yeah, let me address the last point. I've been a member since they founded Jimmy Buffett. I'm a parrot head, I admit. The Save the Manatees organization, and certainly they're active. I mentioned the lawsuit. You could reach out to Bear Warriors to see if they could use your help. There are a number of organizations, Humane Society of the United States, others that try to help out here. Let me come back to the question about septic tanks. Right now, that program is either voluntary or is going to be years away before we retrofit all of the thousands and thousands. But if you are concerned, and good for you if you are, you can voluntarily contact a local septic tank company and tell them you want the new style septic tanks that pollute far less. Unfortunately, even the new ones don't remove 100%. But at least it's a step in the right direction. So thank you for asking that.
And then the final question I have is what the CLE course number for this presentation is. And I actually didn't receive it from you, Gabrielle, before the meeting. Can you say it, shout it out here at the end for us? Or do you have it in a place you can type it out and I will read it aloud?
Yes, it is 8320.
All right, 8320, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And then the last question with 0 seconds remaining is if there's a place we can volunteer to help with manatee rescue.
I would reference that partner page back where we listed all the partners for the rehabilitation. A lot of those facilities offer volunteer positions.
Excellent. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Remember to join the animal law section for more great manatee and other animal content. And thank you very, very much to our presenters today. You did an excellent job, and we are again so lucky to have you. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Be well.